Okay. Okay. What's that? Hi, everybody. Hello, Kay. Hi, Dolores. Hello, Terry. Good evening, Terry says. Hey, friends. I may not be able to hang out tonight having a toothache that's shooting in my war. So if it starts hurting worse, I'll have to take something and tap out. Thanks for understanding. Sure, Terry. Kay says shared. Kay says, hi, everybody. Glad to see you. Dolores says, hi, all. Hi, everybody. Terry says, my ear, stupid autocorrect. Yeah. Hope everybody's doing well tonight. I'm doing well. Is there something special going on tonight? I ask, of course, because our attendance is very limited. Please share as well as you can. Hi, Deborah. Nice to see you. How are you doing? Okay, so as you might imagine, a just transition to a new system that serves us all better is going to require public investment. And there's an article about that, which I'll share now. And this appeared in Truth Out. Nice picture. Biden build back fossil free. We need a Green New Deal, not oil pipelines or climate chaos. This is by Liana First-Arai, from March 17th, 2021. Truth Out. In spite of overt efforts by some energy executives to convince consumers otherwise, the global economy is already in the throes of a transition away from the drilling, refining, and burning of fossil fuels, as we saw just yesterday. The value of fossil fuel companies is, over a period of time, getting drastically reduced, or at least the value of the reserves is getting drastically reduced over a period of time, as wind and solar get to be more and more important, and geothermal, of course, for certain communities, such as the estimated 1/4 of counties in the United States, with the greatest potential for wind and solar that are existing fossil fuel employment hubs. A reasonably smooth economic transition to a fossil-free economy may be well within reach. But for many workers, the idea that an energy transition, unquote, is upon us still sounds the alarm. The, quote, zero emissions, unquote, of climate policy proposals bring with it the electrification of everything. Ditching combustion engines for electric ones in cars, trucks, and buses, and equipping houses with heat pumps to replace natural gas furnaces, for instance, while an aggressive commitment to electrifying all aspects of the economy would create an estimated 25 million in jobs in the U.S. by some estimates. It's a process often understood as automation, quote unquote, the repercussions of which those working in industry are no stranger. In the past, automation in workplaces, from oil rigs to rubber plants, has meant layoffs, school and municipal budget deficits, and in many cases, the devastation of entire towns. A new report released today by the Labor Network for Sustainability, LNS, details how working people in the United States have been abandoned by their employers and their elected officials during countless prior economic transitions, and suggests that failing to learn from past catastrophes in the shift away from fossil fuels could lead to significant further social unrest. Quote, "We have rarely done a good job of supporting workers and their communities through these transitions," unquote, said said Michael Leon Guerrero, executive director, KFLNS. Quote again, "If we are to move forward on the climate policies we have to assure to the greatest extent possible that workers and their communities will not get left hanging," unquote. The report, called the Just Transition Learning Project, draws on qualitative data from 100, quote, "listening sessions," unquote, with union and non-union manufacturing and industrial workers, including those in the fossil fuel industry, but also public sector workers, educators, and other community members living in areas that have already experienced or anticipate some form of economic transition, like a factory sent overseas or the decommissioning of a power plant. The research is the most comprehensive to date to gauge U.S. labor and community sentiment around the current energy transition, and offers labor, activist, and broader community perspectives on how hyperlocal challenges and community envisioned solutions might be balanced with and supported by federal funds and a big picture policy blueprint. In addition to labor groups, participants include members of environmental justice and other community organizations, and span the U.S. geographically, though the West Coast is slightly overrepresented and the South underrepresented. Across each of these groups, 63% of participants identified as white, 19% as Latinx, 10% as Black, and 5% as Indigenous. The co-authors identify the underrepresentation of Black participants as a major weakness, quote unquote, in their data, and encourage more research centering the experiences of Black workers and communities. At its core, the report recognizes that current conversations about our energy transition are still rife with misconceptions. Quote, "The idea of the working class that we conjure up is the big burly white guy with a hard hat on who's whistling at you when you're 25, unquote," one participant said to the researchers. But the identities and commitments of those impacted by the transition from fossil fuels to other forms of energy are much more complex. Quote, "To have a just transition in this country, to have it after we come out of the pandemic, to have it when we get off of fossil fuels, people who do all that work, caring for children, teaching children, caring for sick people, delivering food," unquote. Many who are women of color, the same person had noted, quote again, "Those people need to be paid a living wage to bring about a truly," quote, "just transition," unquote. The report suggests policymakers must consider innovating in ways that reach far beyond offering a 60-year-old refinery worker a spot in a coding boot camp, when his most pressing concern might be doing whatever it takes to stay on the job so he can keep his health insurance, for instance. On the contrary, our responses must consider immediate and long-term needs, be holistic, ambitious, and participatory. For over half a century, the General Motors GM plant in Lordstown, Ohio, where some listening project participants live or were born, served as the economic pulse of the region. That meant a steady demand for steel from factories in the neighboring Youngstown Warren area, where mills employ tens of thousands of locals, manufacturing materials for nearby assembly, electric, and stamping plants. But in September of 1977, on what's known in the area as Black as Black Monday, unquote, GM announced that the district's largest mills would close for good. 2 years later, another wave of closures cost the community tens of thousands of additional jobs, and the cascade continued. The last of the plants closed in 2018, leaving 1,600 additional community members out of work after GM discontinued production of the Chevrolet Cruze. Youngstown population plummeted from over 150,000 in the mid-20th century to just over 65,000 in 2017. California State University professor and co-author of the LNS report, Vivian Price, told Truth Out, the Lordstown collapse and others like it should remain at the forefront of policymakers' minds. Quote, the thing that touched me was how the closure of the plant wasn't just the end of the paycheck. It meant the breakup of a community, the breakup of families. But many people took the offer of relocation to different places, unquote. In nearby Youngstown, the closest largest city to Lordstown, is now the poorest city in Ohio, a 2020 analysis by Cleveland.com found. And what happened in the region is the kind of collapse that could follow in oil and mining towns now experiencing job loss. 8,000 mine workers, the majority employed by oil and gas, were among the latest to lose jobs in February, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. And in the coming years, given the imperfect geographic overlap between towns supported by extractive economies and sites optimal for utility-scale renewable energy projects, communities are likely to face some degree of breakup as workers leave home for new opportunities. In Lordstown, the dislocation was traumatic. I think that's where a lot of our suicides came from, one respondent said to LNS researchers. Auto plant closures have been linked to increased opioid overdoses, according to a study in the journal JAMA, Internal Medicine. Quote, people just weren't prepared for that move, that life. They got there and it was all wrong, unquote, the participants said. In addition to the creation of, quote, rapid response teams in every state to address job displacement, like one program in the state of Massachusetts, the co-authors feature. The recommendations of the report include support for what's known as the PRO Act, a set of proposed changes to labor law that would protect the right to organize for all workers, including those currently classified as contractors. The proposed bill, which is currently before Congress, could aid in preventing the unwinding of communities like what happened in Lordstown by ensuring that jobs outside of industries in decline, including those that have yet to be dreamed up, might bring with them a similar kind of camaraderie, security, benefits, and compensation as coveted union gigs. Quote, we need more good jobs so that everyone can benefit, unquote, said Price. The PRO Act might also level the playing field for workers, given that racial division and injustice often exists along union lines. Fracking companies tend to employ more workers of color than other segments of the fossil fuel industry, Price points out, and they also tend to be non-union, which means less pay. Quote, if we don't think about the margins, the fringes, the non-unionized areas of the fossil fuel industry, then we're discounting the lives, okay, of immigrant workers and black workers as well as indigenous workers, said Price. More broadly, the legislation might open up the renewable energy industries, now largely non-union, to organizing. Quote, the green sector is like any other new sector. They want to pay as low as they can, unquote. The executive director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council, Brad Markle, recently said to the Washington Post, quote, but that just can't be the way this green economy thing is going to go down, unquote. In spite of the community's trauma, workers in Lordstown, Ohio have formed a successful just transition program, as Price and her co-authors highlight in the report. When GM announced it would shutter its last car assembly plant in 2019, union leadership stepped in. The UAW local chapter, in collaboration with Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, and Representative Tim Ryan, also Democrat of Ohio, together applied for a grant through the U.S. Department of Labor to establish a, quote, transition center, unquote. The program they funded was holistic, and the union members in charge were in close touch with workers and their families' needs. The center itself is staffed by laid-off union members, where counseling, job application support, transportation assistance, child care, and access to funding for retraining programs, mostly in nursing and HVAC, are available in an old union center that serves as a community hub. Quote, we pushed for it and we got it, unquote, one worker said of the program. It wasn't just the government like, quote, let's put this thing in there, unquote. The report points to 6 additional exemplary, though imperfect, community-led just transition programs, including a decades-long partnership between United Steelworkers Local and a strategic policy center to organize an electric bus manufacturing plant in Los Angeles County, a BIPOC-led effort to charge polluters to fund reinvestment projects in Washington State, and a 6-year employee protection program for loggers, okay, who are out of work, that included hiring indigenous workers to restore damaged ecosystems, according to the LNS report. The programs are all led by locals and draw from state and federal funds. While the Washington State project was ultimately voted down, it resulted in the formation of what may be the broadest existing coalition in the United States dedicated to a clean energy future. The solution that workers want, which range from wage replacement subsidy programs, ensuring that earnings in new jobs match paychecks from prior jobs, to more systematic transformations like decoupling health insurance from employment and a federal jobs guarantee, must be part of a national strategy that weaves initiatives that are local into a more inclusive economy. Quote, such a strategy is urgent because the anxiety and anger of workers and communities impacted by unjust transitions is ripe for appropriation by exactly the people who caused the injustices to which they respond, unquote. Price and her co-authors writes. And that should give you an impression of the kind of aid that should be forthcoming from the federal government in order to facilitate a just transition. But it's one thing to identify the kind of aid that is needed to help people to make that kind of a transition, and it's entirely another to actually get the assistance that's needed from the federal government. And our next piece, we'll get into that. It is today's column by Dave Dayen. And it says something that is on Evelina's mind, I just noticed. Filibuster reform's greatest champion sees a moment for resolution. And this was by Dave Dayen today. Here's a photo of Jeff Merkley, the Democrat of Oregon, holding a press event on Wednesday to introduce Senate Bill 1, the For the People Act, the companion bill to H.R. 1 in the House that we've talked about here. Okay, good deal. Dave said there's a lot of talk about the filibuster these days as Democrats recognize they cannot enact their full agenda through by reconciliation. But the first conversation I had with a member of the Senate about the filibuster was 2009. Jeff Merkley was a first-term senator from Oregon, not even a year into his freshman term, and he was frustrated. And about the same time, early in 2009, it just so happened that I wrote the first of many blog posts that were dedicated to trying to get rid of the filibuster. Quote, there's no question that the Senate has become dysfunctional, and it's not good for democracy, unquote. He told me then. He's referring to Jeff Merkley here. He was at that time working on reform ideas, but cautioned, quote, it's going to be a long-term project, unquote. Dave says he was right. But we're moving a few inches closer to fruition now. Joe Biden, a creature of the Senate for 36 years, called for reform this week, similar to what was in place when he first started out. Quote, you had to stand up and command the floor. You had to keep talking, Biden said. Quote again, once you stopped talking, you lost that, and someone could move in and say, quote, I move the question of, unquote. This is a version of the talking filibuster where a refusal to end debate means that senators must actually debate if they want to obstruct. Jeff Merkley, in an interview with The Prospect, also looked at the past. He was an intern in liberal Republican Senator Mark Hatfield's office in 1976, and he saw how the Senate, which Biden was in at the time, operated. The chair would call on members, they'd hold a debate, and the question would be moved. Quote, I left D.C. in 1991, came back in 2009, and I was like, quote, what happened to this place, unquote, he said. Quote again, I was so shocked when I came to the Senate and saw how it had deteriorated as an institution in those 18 years from 1991 to 2009. The Biden endorsement of a talking filibuster was very helpful, quote unquote, Merkley said. He's been pushing a similar proposal for a decade. Every Democratic senator who was here in 2011 voted for the talking filibuster, Merkley pointed out, with the exception of Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat of California, who missed the vote. That includes Joe Manchin, incidentally, though not Kyrsten Sinema. Of course, she was not in the Senate yet. I think at that time she was probably in the House, but I'm not even sure she'd gotten that far. Anyway, a talking filibuster is sadly short of simple majority rule, but it's what's on the table now. It pressures the minority to come up with the votes to block a bill rather than pressuring the majority to find votes to advance a bill. You could make it so that a percentage of those present and voting, quote unquote, can end a debate. So if you're not in the Senate chamber, you cannot block progress, or you could force the maximum number of 41 senators who want to block a vote to do so on the floor. Manchin apparently took this off the table last night, said Dave. But he's been a bit all over the place on the filibuster, which, by the way, folks, makes you wonder whether he's really serious about doing anything about the filibuster, or is just talking so that he can seem like he's reasonable and rational and open to compromise, when he may not be any of those things. Anyway, Merkley's original concept was that the filibuster would just have to happen in the open, as was the case before an inadvertent rule change in 1975 allowed obstruction to occur quietly. On a bill like the democracy reforming H.R. 1, for example, Jeff Merkley is a co-author of the Senate version, S1, a senator would have to firmly state opposition to very popular provisions over and over again. Quote, if you have a talking filibuster, that member would have to talk about preventing vote by mail on the floor of the Senate, unquote. Now, the support, he said, Jeff Merkley said, that is, quote, again, the people support getting rid of gerrymandering. They support vote by mail. Let's have that debate in the light of day, unquote. This sounds good in theory, says Dave, though critics have said it would mostly provide theater and not reach its intended goal of actually getting work done. One filibustering senator could hand off to another and another Biden's innovation that anyone could interject to, quote, call the question, unquote, would be a powerful tool, as would forcing the minority to hold the floor together. Jeff Merkley offered other ideas in our conversation. One was to give the minority the ability to offer germane amendments to a bill in exchange for giving up the ability to block it. He said that was unlikely to happen under Mitch McConnell. Another is to carve out a particular area of legislation and to free that from filibuster restrictions. There's a compelling argument that Republicans have repeatedly done this for their priorities. Senator McConnell very explicitly blew out the supermajority threshold for the Supreme Court nominees. Plus, you aren't really supposed to use the reconciliation process for tax cuts, as Republicans did under Bush by inventing a new rule. Democrats changed the rule back, and Republicans reversed it again for the Trump tax cuts. Quote, the base is angry, he said. And quote again, they're asking, how can Republicans change the filibuster for tax cuts for the rich and Supreme Court nominations, and you can't for your priorities, unquote. You could see this kind of carve-out for a bedrock principle like voting rights. Quote, the ballot box is under assault, unquote. said Jeff Merkley. As talk has heated up, Senator McConnell has vowed to make life impossible for the majority if the filibuster is eliminated. How would anyone know? Says Dave Dayen. Life is already impossible for the majority in the Senate. And I think Democrats, based on their public statements, are aware of the emptiness of that threat. Now that Biden has weighed in, Merkley believes it's time to get Senate Democrats in a room together, which hasn't happened since the COVID crisis, to have an honest discussion about a resolution. Quote, it's very clear that those who worked so hard to get us elected do not accept the argument that Senator McConnell can veto the priorities of the American people, unquote. Unquote again, failure is not an option, said Jeff Merkley. So, yes, the filibuster is a requirement. Modifying the filibuster, at least getting rid of it, perhaps, is a requirement for getting a just transition actually completed. Why? Because you really need to get H.R. 1 actually passed. That is very, very important. Here's an article from Common Dreams on March 16th, reporting the results of an analysis that details how a bill in Congress could stop GOP voter suppression nationwide. The article is from Kenny Stansel, the staff writer there. And there's a picture of people demonstrating to stop voter suppression, have safe elections, and to stop the stealing of votes. In response to the GOP's ongoing nationwide assault on voting rights that threatens to restrict ballot access for tens of millions of Americans, the Brennan Center for Justice released a new analysis Tuesday, showing that if the Senate joins the House in passing the For the People Act, Congress can, quote, thwart every single one of the more than 250 voter suppression bills that have been introduced by Republican lawmakers in 43 states. Yes, as you know, the Republicans have been going crazy introducing voter suppression bills in all of the states in which they control the legislature, and in many states where they don't. Last week, bills intended to make voting more difficult, particularly for communities of color and other Democratic-leaning constituencies, was advanced in Georgia by the GOP-controlled state Senate, while Iowa Republican Governor Kim Reynolds signed into law a bill that curbs early voting. This legislative campaign to suppress the vote can and must be stopped by Congress, wrote the Brennan Center. As it turns out, nearly all of the GOP's recent attacks on the franchise, which critics say are inseparable from the lies about voter fraud that former President Donald Trump told in his failed attempt to reverse the outcome of the 2020 elections, could be defeated with the passage of the Democratic Party's top priority for legislation, the For the People Act, H.R. 1 and S1. As the advocacy group Repair Our Democracy explained last week, this transformative and popular package of pro-democracy reforms would directly address these restrictions by removing obstacles to voting nationwide and ensuring that every American can participate in fair, accessible elections regardless of what state they live in, unquote. With the exception of legislation introduced in 7 states to, quote, eliminate or limit sending absentee ballots to voters who do not specifically request those ballots, unquote. The For the People Act would nullify all of the remaining state-level voter suppression bills, according to the analysis of the Brennan Center. And there's a tweet about that. As the Brennan Center noted, the For the People Act, quote, would create a national baseline for voting access that every American can rely on, and it would foil state efforts to manipulate voting rules to exclude eligible voters or create discriminatory outcomes, unquote. In its analysis, the group offered this breakdown to show how the For the People Act would, in some cases, would not nullify proposed state-level voting restrictions. First of all, limit on who can vote by mail. And for Alabama, Arizona, Colorado, by Georgia, Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Washington, yes, H.R. 1 would require national no-excuse voting by mail. If there's a restrictive bill introduced, okay, that eliminates or reduces permanent absentee, okay, early voting lists, as in Arizona, Florida, Hawaii, New Jersey, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, yes, it would require that states at the option of a voter treat a vote by mail application as an application to vote by mail in all future federal elections. If the restricted bill would eliminate or limit sending absentee ballots to voters who do not specifically request those ballots, as in Arizona, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Washington, unfortunately, that is one restriction that is not addressed in H.R. 1. I believe that's the only one, okay, that's not addressed. If the bill were to eliminate or limit sending, if the bill were to eliminate or sending absentee ballot applications to voters who do not specifically request those applications, as in Connecticut, Georgia, Iowa, Illinois, North Dakota, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas, yes, H.R. 1 would require that states transmit absentee ballot applications to all of the registered voters. If the bill were to restrict who can assist in returning a voter's ballot, as in Alaska, Arizona, Connecticut, Kansas, Kentucky, Maryland, New York, Oklahoma, okay, and Minnesota, yes, it would prohibit states from placing limits on how many absentee ballots a person can return on behalf, okay, of others. So in other words, it would block those bills that are trying to get rid of the practice of voter harvesting. Tighten witness signature requirements for mail ballots, as in Alaska, Arizona, California, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia, yes, it would prohibit witness signature requirements for absentee ballots. In state bills that would restrict where and how voters may return absentee ballots, as in Arizona, Georgia, Missouri, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, yes, it would require that voters be allowed to return absentee ballots by mail at a polling place, at a tribally designated building, at a drop box, or at a state or local election office. If a bill tightens signature matching requirements for ballots, as in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, H.R. 1, yes, would require giving voters notice and opportunity to cure signature defects, and that all determinations of discrepancy be made by two trained election officials. If a bill were to tighten or impose the ballot receipt deadlines, as in Arizona, Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, and Pennsylvania, yes, it would require that states accept eligible absentee ballots up to 10 days after Election Day. If a bill were to eliminate or limit early voting, as in Georgia, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Washington, yes, H.R. 1 would require a minimum of 14 consecutive days of early voting. If a bill would tighten or impose voter ID requirements, as in Alaska, Arkansas, Arizona, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Massachusetts, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi. What is any? Sorry, it has escaped me what the initials NE stand for. I'm sure some of you know. Anyway, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, and Wyoming. Gee, I'm trying to think of what NE is. Just won't come. Yes. Oh, Nebraska. There it is. Nebraska. Yes, it would require states to accept a sworn written statement in lieu of the documentary ID, except for certain first-time voters. If a bill would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, as in Arizona, Indiana, Michigan, New York, and Texas, yes, H.R. 1 would require that states accept voter registrations that meet the current legal requirements under the National Voter Registration Act, which do not include citizenship documents. If a bill were to eliminate or prevent same-day voter registration, as in Arizona, Connecticut, Hawaii, Montana, New Hampshire, and Virginia, H.R. 1 says yes, it would require same-day voter registration. If a bill were to eliminate or prevent automatic voter registration, as in Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, or New Jersey, yes, it would require automatic voter registration. And finally, if a bill would expand voter purges, as in Alabama, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Michigan, but also Missouri, Mississippi, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, South Dakota, Texas, and Utah, H.R. 1 would prohibit purges based solely on unreliable evidence like past failure to vote, prohibit voter caging, and limit inaccurate purges based on interstate cross-checks. So that's from a table by the Brennan Center for Justice. While the For the People Act also seeks to combat corruption by addressing issues of campaign finance and ethics, Repair Our Democracy highlighted some of the landmark bill's key provisions that, if passed, would outlaw almost all the GOP's attempts to roll back voting rights following the historic turnout in the 2020 elections. And that encompasses the following bullet points: establishing automatic and same-day voter registration nationwide. Next, requiring every state to have online systems that allow voters to register to vote, update their information, and request absentee ballots. Third, requiring at least 15 consecutive days of early voting and mandating that early voting locations be open for at least 10 hours per day. Prohibiting voter purges and banning the use of non-forwardable mail. Boy, they were playing all kinds of tricks, weren't they? And committing to passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would reestablish pre-clearance requirements for states attempting to pass restrictive voting laws. Congress has the legal and constitutional power, this is a quote, to stop voter suppression laws cold, unquote, said the president of the Brennan Center, Michael Waldman, last week. Quote again, what it needs is the political will. Earlier this month, a Democratic-controlled House passed the For the People Act without the support of a single Republican. Voting rights advocates say that unless Democrats in the evenly split Senate should abolish the 60-vote filibuster, an anti-democratic tool currently allowing the Republican minority to block the enactment of popular bills, the For the People Act is unlikely to be passed by the upper chamber. And if the For the People Act is not passed, then most probably what will happen is that bills that are able to ensure a just transition to a new system would be blocked once the Republicans regain control of at least one of the houses of Congress beginning in 2023. Because if H.R. 1 and S1 don't pass, it's almost certain that it will be possible for the Republicans to win back one or both houses in the election of 2022. Anyway, finally, for this article, when combined with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the For the People Act, quote, includes all the critical reforms needed to prevent voter suppression, unquote, the Brennan Center wrote Tuesday. In the middle of a withering attack on voting rights in nearly every state, the Senate must now get to work and pass the bill into law. So here's a new requirement for just transition embodied in a new bill that was just introduced into the Senate by one Bernie Sanders. And that new bill, the Sanders bill, would hike taxes on big corporations that pay CEOs over 50 times more than the median worker. This is on March 17, 2021, by Jake Johnson. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont on Wednesday unveiled a bill that would hike taxes on large corporations that pay their CEOs over 50 times more than the median worker, an effort to combat the decades-long trend of skyrocketing inequality in the United States. Under the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act, there's a PDF attached, which is a PDF of the act, or the bill, I should say, because it's not yet an act until it passes. Quote, corporate tax rate would increase by 0.5% for those companies reporting a CEO to median worker pay ratio of 50-1, and grow to a rate of 5% for those companies reporting a ratio of 500-1 or higher, according to a summary of the proposal released by Bernie's office. Quote, the bill also requires the Treasury Department to issue issue regulations to prevent tax avoidance, including against companies that increase the use of contractors rather than employees, unquote. The summary notes. And quote again, pay ratio data for privately held corporations would also be made public, just as publicly held corporations are required to make public under current law. In a statement, Sanders warned that the United States is, quote, moving toward an oligarchic form of society. I think most of us would think that it is already there, where the very rich are doing phenomenally well and working families are struggling in a way we've not seen since the Great Depression, unquote, due to the coronavirus pandemic and resulting economic crisis. Quote, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, this is a quote from Bernie, the American people are demanding that large, profitable corporations pay their fair share of taxes and treat their employees with the dignity and respect they deserve. That is what this legislation will begin to do, unquote. The Vermont senator's new legislation, co-sponsored in the Senate by Senators Warren, Markey, and Van Hollen, of Maryland, came as he presided over the Budget Committee hearing Wednesday that will focus primarily on wealth and income inequality. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest person on the planet, declined Sanders' invitation to attend the hearing, which also featured testimony for an Amazon employee who works at the Bessemer, Alabama fulfillment center that's currently in the middle of a closely watched and potentially groundbreaking a union drive. Quote, I intend to talk about the most important issues facing working families. Right now, I happen to believe that this country is on its way to an oligarchy, unquote. That was a quote from Bernie to the Wall Street Journal before the hearing. According to Bernie's office, the new legislation would bring the federal government around $150 billion in revenue over a decade if current corporate pay patterns continue. Sanders' team noted that if the bill had been in effect last year, Walmart would have paid up to $854.9 million more in taxes. Home Depot would have paid up to $550.8 million more in taxes. JP Morgan Chase would have paid up to $172.8 million more in taxes. Nike would have paid up to $147.7 million more in taxes. McDonald's would have paid up to $69.5 million more in taxes. And American Airlines would have paid up to $22.6 million more in taxes. And Bonnie says, how about Amazon? I don't know. They didn't give the figure for Amazon. Also, I thought, okay, that Bezos was about to retire as the CEO and just become the chairman of the board or something. But anyway, quote, corporate executives have padded their pockets with hefty paychecks and over-the-top compensation packages, while American workers who help generate record corporate profits have hardly seen their wages budge, unquote. Warren said in a statement on Wednesday, quote again, we need to take dramatic steps to address wealth inequality in this country and discouraging massive executive payouts is a good place to start, unquote. Oh, by the way, there's a tweet by Warren Gunnels here which points out that CVS, which pays its CEO 790 times more than its average worker, would pay up to $450 million more in taxes just to add another large company. In a research report last August, the Economic Policy Institute showed that top CEOs in the U.S. earned 320 times as much as the typical worker in 2019. I'm not sure whether the typical worker is the median worker in their study or whether it's the average worker or what, but between 1978 and 2019, EPI found CEO pay soared by 1,167%, while typical worker pay grew by just 13.7%. Oh. And Representative Barbara Lee, Democrat of California, co-sponsor of companion legislation in the House, said Wednesday that it is, quote, unjust and unacceptable that for decades, billions of dollars have gone to those at the top, while workers' wages, especially for workers of color, have remained stagnant, unquote. As millions of families struggle to keep food on the table during a global pandemic and economic justice, it is more important than ever that we close the CEO worker pay gap and ensure that companies pay their workers the wages they deserve, Lee added. Quote again, I'm proud to partner with Senator Sanders to reintroduce the Tax Successive CEO Pay Act to make ultra-wealthy CEOs pay their fair share, unquote. So, to ensure a just transition, it will also be necessary to bring CEO pay in line, because a just transition to a green new system of some kind involves treating and solving the problem of extreme inequality that we have had in our society for so long. It involves defeating the oligarchy. CEO and wealth taxes are an important part of that. I'm only sorry that Bernie would frame this in terms of getting more revenue for the federal government, because, as you know, whatever revenue is collected by the federal government is destroyed in the process of settlement by the Federal Reserve, and entirely new dollars are then created for use by the federal government. It's important to emphasize that the federal government does not use those tax dollars, but it only ever uses dollars that are either created by the Treasury or created by the Federal Reserve, one or the other. If it uses coins or coinage, that's created by the Treasury. And if it uses reserves, That's created by the Fed. If it uses currency, the currency is created by the Treasury at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, but it is issued and placed into circulation by the Fed. So just so you know how it really works. So, finally, we come to something else that is often not viewed as important for a just transition. But based on my experience, I tell you, having an appropriate foreign policy is going to be necessary if the transition to a new system is going to be just. As a person who lived through the Vietnam War and saw how the prosecution of the Vietnam War destroyed the war on poverty in the United States and ensured the failure of us solving the problem of poverty back in the 60s. I think that if we don't have radical changes to our foreign policy, that is going to come greatly into conflict with efforts to get a just transition to a new system that will allow us to meet the climate crisis. So let's share the final article for tonight. That is a piece which appeared in Tom Dispatch. The introduction was written by Tom Engelhardt himself. He's the publisher and editor of Tom Dispatch, and by Kevin Tillman, who wrote the actual piece. The introduction was written by Tom Engelhardt. So, this was done on March 16, 2021. And I'll read the introduction by Tom Engelhardt first. President Biden claims that he wants to return to the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, from which President Trump so unceremoniously withdrew. Biden's administration, however, has been refusing to take any significant initial steps, like easing Trump's economic sanctions that might bring the Iranians back to the bargaining table. Meanwhile, the president himself recently ordered a U.S. airstrike in Syria. Yes, Syria. Against Iraqi militias, reputedly backed by Iran and blamed for shooting missiles at military bases in their own country where U.S. troops are still stationed. In other words, when it comes to Iran, so far, the U.S. continues on a familiar path. It is now 67 years since relations between the two countries, ourselves, and Iran, first took a turn for the truly terrible in the wake of a 1953 CIA and British intelligence organized coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, that country's democratically elected prime minister, and turned Iran over to the young Shah and his fearsome secret police, the SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K. They were notorious for their brutality and torture. He was to be our very own autocrat in chief there, in return for access to Iranian oil. And it's never really gotten better, has it? There was the fundamentalist uprising of 1979, sparked by Iranian bitterness over the role Washington had played in its politics for a quarter of a century, that finally sent the Shah to the U.S. and put exiled religious figure Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in power as the country's supreme leader. But few Americans who lived through those days will forget the way diplomats were taken hostage in uh, uh, inside of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, or the failed attempt to free them. And from then on, relations would only worsen. I was 9 years old when that initial coup took place. But today's Tom Dispatch author Kevin Tillman won't even be born for another quarter century. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, like his brother, National Football League star Pat Tillman, Kevin left the world he knew. He was then a minor league baseball player and joined the Army, the U.S. Army. In 2003, he found himself part of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq and saw firsthand what American interference in a foreign land could do when it came to suffering, death, and chaos. In addition, he would later be faced with the U.S. military's infamous cover-up of the nature of his brother's death in Afghanistan. All of that left him with a unique perspective on the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, and yet one that, in truth, the rest of us should have had as well. That introduction is signed Tom. And now we get to the article. On January 6th, the U.S. became a foreign country by Kevin Tillman. Just about everyone was shocked by what happened at the Capitol building on January 6th. But as a former soldier in America's forever wars, horrifying as the scenes were, I also found what happened strangely familiar, almost inevitable. I thought that, if only we'd taken our country's imperial history seriously, none of us would have found that day either shocking or unprecedented. Honestly, it could only seem that way if you imagined our domestic politics as completely separate from our foreign policy. But if we're to learn anything from that maladroit attempt at a government toppling coup, it should be that they're anything but separate. The question isn't whether then President Donald Trump incited the assault on the Capitol. Of course he did. It is rather, since when have we cared if an American president lies to incite an illegal insurrection? In all honesty, our commanders-in-chief have been doing so abroad for generations with complete impunity. It was only a matter of time before the moral rot finally made its way home. Back in 2007, I actually met Nancy Pelosi, whom those insurrectionists were going after. Quote, "Tell Pelosi we're coming for that B asterisk asterisk CH. Tell effing Pelosi, spelled F asterisk asterisk ING, we're coming for her," unquote, in that very Capitol building. That day, my family was testifying before the House Committee. That day refers to back in 2007. That day, my family was testifying before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform concerning the U.S. government's disinformation campaign about how 3 years earlier my brother Pat Tillman had died in Afghanistan as a result of, quote, friendly, unquote, not enemy fire. We would testify alongside former soldier Jessica Lynch, who had suffered a similar disinformation fate in the wake of a tragic ambush of her convoy in Nasiriyah, Iraq, where soldiers died and she was taken prisoner. After the hearing, we discussed the case with Nancy Pelosi, who then took us on a brief personal tour of the halls of the building. Given the circumstances, it was a thoughtful gesture and a humbling experience. So it was personally quite unsettling to watch that rabid mob of insurrectionists storm our Capitol, some actively seeking to kill the woman who had walked our family through those same halls wearing her signature green business suit. To see people desecrating that building over grievances rooted in demonstrable and absurd untruths manufactured by President Trump was both grotesque and shameful. And yet, however serial, disappointing, disqualifying, even treasonous that assault and the 57-43 Senate acquittal of the president would be, what took place should, in another sense, not have been a shock to anyone. The idea that January 6th was something new for this country, and so a unique affront to the American idea of democracy, not to speak of common decency, was simply wrong. After all, ever since 1945, this country has regularly intervened in elections all over the globe and done far worse as well. What's disorienting, I suppose, is that this time we did it to ourselves. My own limited experience with American interventionism involves the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. After the September 11th attacks, I enlisted in the U.S. Army with Pat. We would be assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment, and our unit would in March 2003 be sent into Iraq, one of so many tools in the Bush administration's war of aggression there. He calls it, a war of aggression, because at that moment, at that time, Iraq was doing nothing to us, and it didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, as we later found out. We attacked it first without a provocation. We would help remove Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein by force. It was hardly the mission I had in mind when I signed up. No, he was, of course, looking to go to Afghanistan to look for Osama bin Laden and to avenge the attacks that took place on September 11th of 2001. That was why he and Pat signed up. And when Pat Tillman signed up, of course, that was a moment of great publicity because he gave up a career in the NFL where he was a premier linebacker so that he could go to Afghanistan. That was considered a supreme gesture of patriotism on his part. It was hardly the mission I had in mind when I signed up, but I was naive when it came to foreign policy, as I think was Pat Tillman. Being part of illegal invasions, however, leaves lasting impressions, said Kevin. That particular intervention in Iraq began with a barrage of administration lies about Saddam's supposed supplies of weapons of mass destruction, his reputed links to Al-Qaeda, and the idea that we were liberating the Iraqi people. Some of us actually were assigned to run around Baghdad, quote, east, west, south, and north somewhat, unquote, looking for those non-existent weapons of mass destruction. The whole invasion would prove catastrophic, of course, resulting in the destruction of Iraqi society, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of American soldiers, even as that country's leadership was removed and its military disbanded. But he refers to mission accomplished here, which he also crosses out deliberately. Of course, neither President George W. Bush nor the rest of the top officials of his administration were held responsible for what happened. So I watched the January 6th insurrection unfold. When I watched it unfold, my mind was immediately drawn to the period leading up to the Iraq War, except this time the drumbeat of lies had to do with massive voter fraud, irregularities in voting, quote, dead voters, unquote, rigged software, and other fabrications. Obviously, the two events were drastically different in scale, complexity, and destructiveness. Still, they seem to share common fundamental threads. Examples of American interference in the governance of foreign countries via coups, regime change, and other ploys are commonplaces of our modern history. One of the reasons why I wanted to go through this article was for the sheer listing of the interventions. Some of the best known would be the replacing of a number of democratically elected leaders, like the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh with the Shah in 1953, the Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz with Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas in 1954, Chilean President Salvador Allende with General Augusto Pinochet, particularly notorious, in 1973, or Honduran President Manuel Zelaya in a U.S.-backed coup in 2009. In other words, we're not talking about a few one-off mistakes or a couple of dumb wars. In truth, there has been an endless supply of U.S. interventions around the globe. Invasions, military coups, soft coups, economic sanctions, secretly funding candidates of Washington's choice. And then, by the way, we scream to high heaven about unproved interferences by Iran and Russia in the 2020 elections. We scream to high heaven about how evil that is in the face of our own history of interfering in other nations. But going on, take for example our neighbors in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. I honestly don't know if there is a single nation, Kevin Tillman says, in Latin America that hasn't fallen victim to a U.S. intervention of some sort. Argentina, 1976. Bolivia, 1971. Brazil, 1964. Cuba, 1961. El Salvador, the 1980s. Grenada, 1983. Haiti, 2004. Honduras, 1980 and 2009. Panama, 1989. Paraguay, 1962. Peru, 1968. Suriname, the 1980s. Uruguay, 1973. Venezuela, the present moment. Maybe Costa Rica was spared? Question mark. Venezuela is a particularly interesting case because for 20 years, he forgot to mention the intervention, in Ecuador, which I think has been going on now for some years. But anyway, Venezuela is a particularly interesting case because for 20 years, and by the way, Peru should be here too, right in Colombia. We've been intervening in those places too, in support of supporting tyrannical governments and their rule in those places. Anyway, Venezuela is a particularly interesting case because for 20 years, 3 consecutive presidencies, Washington has unsuccessfully supported multiple coup attempts, levied crippling illegal economic sanctions, and engaged in other types of tricks to topple former President Hugo Chavez and the current president, Nicolas Maduro. Coincidentally, in January of 2019, former President Trump recognized Juan Guaido, a member of the Venezuelan National Assembly, as the country's president. The Guaido had declared himself president after he didn't like the results of an election, not unlike Mr. Trump 2 years later. Looking across the Pacific Ocean, don't forget about the wars we engaged in that ravaged Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, or about Washington's support of Suharto's 1965 military coup in Indonesia. And of course, who doesn't remember what happened and continues to happen in the greater Middle East, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Syria, Yemen, and Iran, among other places? In the last 20 years, Washington's never-ending global war on terror has created a level of death, destruction, and displacement difficult to comprehend, though Brown University's Costs of War project has done a superb, if grim, job of trying to quantify it all. And what I listed above is anything but comprehensive. The point is that generation after generation, Americans have been directly or indirectly involved in or exposed to such rogue behavior, a type of interference that had already long become part of our national fabric by the time it made it to the Capitol. End the tradition. To be sure, this has been a bipartisan pattern, as the administrations of president after president, Democrat and Republican, engaged in it. And we might add, Congress after Congress supported it, whether Democrat or Republican or split. Even if we were to take the position that some of those interventions were somehow legal, moral, or necessary, the behavior itself has become completely normalized as a crucial go-to option for any president. It's also worth noting just what types of nations have typically been targeted for such interventions, usually vulnerable states with weak economies and frail institutions. Whether democracies or dictatorships hasn't seemed to matter. The populations of such countries, however, almost invariably been non-white, putting aside the obvious illegality, immorality, and even cowardice of picking on vulnerable nations. Such acts historically have probably exacerbated the role of jingoism and xenophobia, as well as cultural and racial superiority in this country. Just the sort of thinking so evident on January 6th. This behavior breeds disunity and hate. When it came to overthrowing other governments, our presidents regularly peddled obvious and verifiable lies, broke or disregarded laws, domestic and international, and freely used violence and intimidation to gain power and profit, seldom being held accountable in any fashion for any of it. However, such methods were to come home someday. What happened on January 6th should still be a wake-up call, forcing us all to see what it means when this signature American approach to foreign policy is used against our own democracy. The Capitol insurrection should be, but hasn't yet been, treated as a vivid reminder of the way this country's foreign policy has undermined the American system too. I see it as a form of, quote, blowback, unquote, to use the CIA term popularized long ago by Chalmers Johnson. In some fashion, at least, it undoubtedly influenced the behavior of former President Trump and his followers, explaining why they believed it was a viable option to use force at the Capitol to stop democracy in its tracks. Based on our history, it was a strategy long deployed elsewhere without remorse or fear of repercussions in order to get what American leaders wanted. What once might have seemed improbable for our democracy to suffer suddenly became a reality, one that had long been experienced by so many other peoples at our hands. And if changes aren't made, it won't be the last time either. In his inaugural address, President Biden appeared to tackle many of the big challenges that our country now faces. He spoke with the kind of clarity, kindness, inclusion, and sanity that had been missing of late. Specifically, he addressed the needs of this nation, quote, much to repair, much to restore, much to heal, much to build, and much to gain. To overcome these challenges, to restore the soul, and to secure the future of America requires more than words. It requires that most elusive of things in a democracy, by unity, uniting to fight the common foes we face: anger, resentment, hatred, extremism, lawlessness, violence, disease, joblessness, hopelessness, unquote. President Biden also talked about the dangers of big lies and, quote, alternative facts, unquote, saying, quote, there is truth and there are lies, lies told for power and for profit. And each of us has a duty and responsibility as citizens, as Americans, and especially as leaders who have pledged to honor our Constitution and protect our nation, to defend the truth and to defeat the lies, unquote. No doubt President Biden's concerns do need to be addressed in this time of troubles for us all, and I believe he genuinely meant what he said. From the pandemic to inequality, there are obviously domestic issues driven by developments inside our own borders that need serious attention, as I've been talking about tonight. The need for a just transition to a new system is paramount. That's within our own borders, but it cannot be isolated from our foreign policy, as Kevin Tillman is making the case here in this article. He goes on. However, any efforts to achieve such goals domestically will ultimately fail if those unsustainable contradictions outside our borders persist. If President Biden's calls for unity are to produce tangible and lasting results, what's needed is a holistic approach that extends to America's behavior abroad. In the past, even when President Trump spoke of calling a halt to our endless wars and interventions, the pattern continued. There always seemed to be some reason that made the next act of pillaging, quote, necessary and appropriate, unquote. This time, of course, I hope that the president and his staff will indeed have the courage to break with a tradition. But based on the recent airstrike Biden ordered in Syria, a country his boss helped to ravage while he was vice president, what's probably needed is an organized and vocal demand from the American people. Since it's clear our executive branch has the unchecked power to illegally command insurrections here at home, invade and destroy vulnerable nations at will, relentlessly slaughter and displace families, starve foreign peoples through economic sanctions, foment coups abroad, handpick leaders for other countries with impunity, and send American troops to die for, quote, lies told for power and profit, unquote, against manufactured, quote, foes, unquote, then it's also legally within its power not to do any of that. Perhaps exercising the power, authority, and responsibility to stop the illegal, unlawful, and immoral behavior around the globe could prove a major first step toward the president's goals of unifying both our nation and a shared global community. That was, I think, a brilliant piece and very much to the point. But I also want to summarize this by saying, by summarizing um, all that we talked about here tonight. Specifically, if I can reclaim what I did here. Sorry, hang on for just a second. Our topic for tonight was just transitions and requirements for actually achieving them. And it's obvious that lots of public funding, public investments will be needed to make the kind of transition we are looking for. Big spending will be needed. Probably an infrastructure and green transition bill in the many trillions of dollars. People are talking 4 trillion, 5 trillion, and maybe 7 trillion just in the short run, not over a 10-year period. As Bernie was talking about, he was talking about 16 trillion over a 10-year period. It's probably going to come to that. It may come to more than that. But even now, with what Biden is considering, we may see anywhere from 4 trillion to 7 trillion. How are we going to pass that without at least a reform of the filibuster and the kind of reform where needed legislation can be gotten through by cloture in a reasonable period of time? And by reasonable, we could mean even weeks, like a week or two, or maybe out the outside of 3 weeks, where the bill is particularly big and particularly necessary and particularly important. We very much need, of course, as a requirement for change, we need H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. And as I've mentioned before, H.R. 51 and H.R. 52 as well. Because the Republicans, bless their immortal souls, are currently threatening our democracy, basically proposing to end it by severely repressing voting and rigging voting so that our elections in the future, starting with the election of 2022, would be rigged and fixed um, um, beyond our ability to have a fair election. We also talked about specifically the need to pass bills to lessen the degree, okay, of inequality in our society. And we focused in particular on Bernie Sanders' new bill to tax corporations that gave to CEOs salaries that were 50 times or more the median wages in their corporations. And finally, we talked about the grave need to change on our foreign policy so that the regime change wars and the coups and the sanctions and the wholesale gross interference in the politics of other nations that we've been carrying out at least since the 1950s finally ends. Finally ends. If that does not happen, the chances of our becoming once again embroiled in limited and very expensive wars in foreign lands threaten to derail all of our efforts to have a just transition to a new system here that would also fuel changes in the rest of the world so that we can also meet the number one emergency which faces us, which is, of course, the climate emergency. Time is rapidly running out on that. We need these changes fast. We need them strong. And we need them hard. And with that, I will move to consider your comments. And Deborah says, I'm good. Just got a new granddaughter today. Congrats, Deborah. My first. I can't share to Facebook because I'm in jail for saying Americans are stupid. Deborah says, I shared to Twitter nonetheless. Well, congrats, Deborah. That is wonderful news. As someone who's been a grandparent for more than 15 years now, that is wonderful news. Looking forward to my granddaughter's sweet 16. And there is Troy, who says, hello, world. And Terry Burke says, I know where this is going, to the topic of a Green New Deal and the hashtag FJG, paying a living wage. I wasn't too explicit about the Green New Deal or the FJG, but yes, that was implicit in what I had to say, of course. And Evelina says, the PRO Act is good for workers. Will it pass? Not if the filibuster stays the way it is. Kay says, Evelina Pont, they'll have to get rid of the filibuster if they expect anything good to pass. Evelina says, I agree, which is why it's a rhetorical question. Will the filibuster be busted? And right after you said that, Evelina, I went on to talk about the filibuster. Kay said, I hope so, but still don't know for sure. Evelina says, the talking filibuster is a lot of blah, blah, laugh out loud. It is a lot of blah, blah, but what some are proposing is that the talking filibuster not only be brought back, but that it be changed. So when they talk, they have to talk about matters that are materially related to the substance of the bill that they are filibustering. That would be a big change. In other words, no more reading Dr. Seuss, no more reading the Bible, no more reading the telephone book. Terry Burke says, Farmville actually had the guts to tell McConnell, bring it on, quote unquote, as McConnell threatened scorched earth against the people. Who's Farmville? Oh, Carville. Damn you, autocorrect. I remind you, Terry, that a few nights ago, I had the guts to tell McConnell to bring it on. Don't you remember? I think he'll look so silly, he'll doom the Republican Party to losses for a generation. Evelina says, but Nixon president in 1975, I forget. No, Nixon was gone by 1974. Ford was the president in 1975. Gerald Ford. Kay says, not sure right now, but Pelosi has actually virtually disappeared lately. I don't think she's disappeared. She's there passing bills. She's passing bills. She just passed HR 1. She passed something else today. I forget what it was, but it was a pretty good bill. There's no question about it. She's passing a lot of bills where they're expected to go to the Senate to die. That's the situation we're in now. Kay says, oh, I think she passed the bill for possibly Puerto Rican statehood, or anyway Puerto Rican self-determination, which I believe is HR 54, if I remember correctly. Or is that, I'm sorry, HR 52. Kay says she's there when he has to be, laugh out loud, when she has to be. And Kay says Houston from Ohio is trying to sue Biden's rule that state money has to be spent on people who work for the state and not for tax breaks. Shake my head. I hate Ohio. I don't think that's Biden's rule. I think that's part of the legislation. Kay says, still no check for me. Hasn't come for me yet either, Kay. Kay said, I heard from some neighbors that they already got theirs. Oh, did they get checks or direct deposits in their account? Because I heard from one of my neighbors that he got a direct deposit in his account, or he got a notice to look out for a direct deposit in his account as early as last Saturday. Evelina says, hang in there, Kay. Hope you get it before month's end. Would be a nice way to greet April. Kay says, yes, it would, Evelina. And Troy says, any Nebraska. Yes, Nebraska. I remembered. Kay says, Nebraska, laugh out loud. And Evelina says, Dems keen on getting HR 1 passed, aren't they, Dr. Joe? Yes, they are keen on getting HR 1 passed. I think they do want to keep control of their chairmanships and stuff like that. And Kay says, Bernie is still trying to work for the people. Yes, he is. Kay said, I watched that meeting, very good. Yeah, it was very good, wasn't it? And Troy says, as George Bush said, put FOID on families and let doctors practice their love on their patients. What's that? Troy says, I can't type. My eyes are crusting over. Been going on for 3 days, driving by Braille and almost topping by Braille. Everything blurry. Oh my God, Troy. Sounds tough. Evelina says, not just, but necessary. Sensible foreign policy with a solidarity component. And Terry says, Biden is saber rattling at Russia. It doesn't look like he gives a damn about good foreign policy. Evelina says, why wasn't Russia's failure in Afghanistan, why wasn't it a lesson to American leaders? Iraq was also politically expedient. Wouldn't make any sense otherwise. Well, the story about Iraq is that what Bush was after there was revenge against Saddam, who supposedly ordered an assassination attempt on his father. That's the story anyway. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, I think we believe that Russia's failure there was due to our intervention in support of the Taliban, because we supported the insurrection there. They think that was a big factor in the failure of Russia to keep control, of Afghanistan. We thought, of course, since Russia wasn't going to be strong enough to greatly help the Taliban, when it came to ourselves, I think we thought we would be more successful, than Russia was. But also, I think we felt there was an imperative for us to go, because one of the stories told, about Afghanistan was that somehow the Taliban were directly involved in the bombings at 9/11, rather than being indirectly involved, but by providing the stamping grounds for bin Laden and his people. Evelina said, don't even get me started on regime change, in Latin America. And Lana says, I didn't get the announcement. You don't get how can you not get the announcement? It must be YouTube fooling around on it. Catherine Tokarska says, hello all, boondocking in Quartzsite, Arizona. Catherine says, hello from Quartzsite, Arizona. Evelina Pons says, Colombia and Peru have right-wing governments. Chile, Paraguay, Brazil, Ecuador too, not to mention all of Central America, with the exception of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, right? Costa Rica doesn't have a right-wing government, does it? And Evelina says, lucky you, laugh out loud. Lucky K says, we need to keep our noses out of other countries. And Troy says, also Bolivia. Yes, we have been intervening like crazy in Bolivia for ages. And Pelosi recognized Juan Guaido as well. Yes, I know. She was feting or whatever. Feting, Feting. Terry Burke, so has the brother ever caught on that these coups on wars are to enrich ammunition manufacturers and related entities? Yes. I believe that Kevin Tillman is at this point very anti-war and very much aware of the military-industrial complex. Evelyn said, oh brother, how about putting his money where his mouth is? No chance. Terry Burke says Biden is lying about Russia and Iran right now. He is part of the problem. He is. Terry says, boy, is Kevin going to be disappointed. I think we're all going to be disappointed. Evelina says, seems to me other large powers, even developing nations, are talking about a multilateral world and global solidarity. Do you think it's propaganda? No. I think that is what they want because that is what is most favorable to them. It's in their national interest. And I think that China wants that too for the time being. In other words, they don't want us to be the superpower any longer. That is in their interest. And guess what? I think that is in our interest too, if we were smart enough to be able to recognize our interest. There has to be a big debate on what's in the national interest of the United States. And I think it is to join a multilateral world practicing global solidarity. Terry says Republicans want an authoritarian dictatorship. I know. I would even say they want a fascist dictatorship.
They know that China hasn't had a war in a long time.
So Bonnie asks whether people know that China hasn't been involved in a war for more than a generation now. I think the last war we had was the relatively little skirmish with India. I'm not sure anymore. I don't remember exactly when that is. I think it was in the 80s sometime. But it's been a long time since they were involved in a war, okay, of any time, any kind. Kay says Tom Hartman was calling the GOP a death cult, and I think that is true. So do I. Call the GOP a death cult. I agree with Tom Hartman. Tom Hartman. Terry says they almost don't want the 1400 because I think it's a payoff to keep us complacent for their planned wars. We all need that 1400, and we need monthly payments of $2,000 beyond that for as long as this crisis lasts, and then $1,000 for each of us after the crisis, for 1 year after the crisis has passed. Evelina says, yeah, but it isn't just the GOP. And Troy says, my eyes are clearing up. They were too dry. Well, that's great. Kay says, I agree, Evelina. Evelina says, it will fly out of your hands before you have time to ponder it. Evelina Pons, spot on. Tom needs to expose this administration as well. And Kay says, Terry Burke, he has. Troy says, congratulations, Deborah. Evelina says, okay, just haven't seen Pelosi in the media. Terry says, yes, you kicked Mitch's $, the other night, Dr. F. You flipped that nasty turtle on his back. Smile.
Happy birthday to Rocco.
Huh?
Happy birthday to Rocco Million.
Happy birthday to Rocco Million if he's out there somewhere. And Troy says, I remember President Ford as portrayed by Chevy Chase, always bumping his head. Terry says, Kay's just going to buy more beer with it. Terry said, Kay's correction. Kay said, not funny, Terry. Evelyn has said, oh my God, is that right about Bush Jr. and the Afghanistan story about Russia's failure? Yeah, I think that might be right. Kay says, wanted to try to remodel my room with it. Kay said, Terry, get out of my comments. Terry said, clink, clink, cheers. Evelyn says, you'll make it. Just watch. And Troy says, Afghani freedom fighters later labeled as terrorists. Yes. Yes, the Taliban were originally labeled as freedom fighters. Terry Burke said, with beer decor. Kay said, go away, Terry. Kay said, but Terry, GFY. Terry said, burp. Evelina said, referendum now, debate on world solidarity and what's in the USA's interest. And Troy said, the Vietnam was supported by the Soviets, I think, not the Chinese. I think at first it was supported primarily by the Soviets, okay, and not by the Chinese. But I think in the final stages of the war, it was supported by the Chinese in various economic ways. I don't think there were any Chinese troops there, okay, in Vietnam. I don't think there were any Soviet troops, okay, in Vietnam. And Troy said South Korea was the last war that China was in. No, China had a war with India that it was involved in the Himalayas, if I recall correctly. Kay says, I don't need harassment in this discussion group. Let me say something about that. Okay, it is true, folks. Nobody needs to be personally harassed in this discussion group. So please keep that in mind as a rule of this group. We do not harass each other. We are a friendly group. We disagree with each other from time to time. We do not make comments on personal things, where the comments are not welcome. So please refrain. Okay, I think that does it for tonight. So let us end on a happy birthday for Rocco Million. And Terry says, not harassment. I just see you talk about beer, but okay, sorry. And Kay says, yes, Joe, and thank you. I thank you all for coming. And again, happy birthday to Rocco. I don't know if he'll tune in to see his happy birthday on this, but in any case, thank you all for coming. And I will see you on Saturday night with another scintillating episode of the In-Depth Show. And congratulations again to you, Deborah. It is a very big event. Deborah says good night all, and Lana says good night. And Kay says thank you for a great discussion. Love you all. We love you, Kay. And Terry says Rocco is a Tandon supporter. Rocco Million? How can he be a Tandon supporter? He can't be a Tandon supporter. He's a dyed-in-the-wool MMTer. He can't be a Tandon supporter. I mean, Tandon is a skunk. And Dolores says, thank you and good night all. And Troy says, I forgot about the China versus India land dispute. And Deborah says, good show. My hubby loved it tonight. Oh, well, say hi to him. I'm glad he liked it. So, Saturday night, folks, at 9 p.m. if the creeks don't rise, as I think they say in Ohio. Terry says, yep, he defends her. Few Tandon. Rocco defends Neera Tandon?
No way.
I'm going to have to explain things to him. Anyway, good night all.